You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 527 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer at RT. He has bylines at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and can frequently be found at the Libertarian Institute, which is also where you find this show and the daily news roundup that I write. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me back. How you doing, man?
Doing well. We got some, I think, stories today to talk about that maybe, don't take place in the Middle East, but take place here. And rather than having a ton of details about the story, I'm looking forward to having a few, more kind of discussions about what was said and what's being done, particularly with this first story I have, which I think is something that maybe a lot of libertarians know. And so it kind of goes unsaid, but I don't think it is generally something that people like just, your average normie, as the term goes, knows. And that is, we have Boeing CEO saying that no matter who wins in November, his company is going to be all right. And, Boeing is a company that I think is really the epitome of the problem with like the military industrial complex. But on top of that, they also do have I don't want to say civilian side of the company because that sounds weird, but they make more regular planes too, and so they're involved in bailouts and subsidies on that end as well, not just taking the Pentagon money. And so when a company like Boeing says that, hey, I know that all these American people are freaking out thinking that this upcoming election is like this huge existential crisis and it's about the future of our country. You have like the most well-connected people to the government, people who you would kind of think would be the most impacted by, two radically different presidents shrugging their shoulders and saying, this really isn't a big deal. So, Will, I guess I'll kind of let you take it from there and just why does the, war state not care at all about who's going to be president?
Yeah, I found this comment kind of funny. This came on a call with reporters from Dave Calhoun, the CEO of Boeing, and Boeing is of course a top U.S. arms contractor, one of the largest in the country, and a senior partner, I would say, in the military-industrial complex. They're one of the largest firms in that whole orbit. And yet this comment was very revealing. I think he was it seemed like he was trying to come off as fair-minded or neutral and not to get too overly political or something. That seemed to be the context of what he was saying. But it came off to me more like an admission. He was saying that when it comes to Trump and Biden, on so-called defense spending, they'll pretty much both be the same. Both will help the weapons industry equally. He said they do it in different ways, but in the end, he said Boeing literally has no preference on one or the other. Apparently these two guys are so reliable. They're so trustworthy when it comes to hooking up the military industrial complex that Boeing doesn't even have a public position on this, at least according to the CEO, who said, he actually came out and said that there is we have no preference. And as you're saying, it is kind of interesting to note that their private or commercial business activity have been suffering a lot because of the pandemic. Air travel has been totally decimated. Nobody's really flying. So Boeing's air sales are kind of down. They've been having all kinds of problems with some of their aircraft. The MAX has been, having a long series of problems.
I would just add there, let's make sure we put that in order that the company was really struggling because, they really messed up with the 737 MAX. I think the B were the ones where whatever kind of rear, I don't know, planes, but for whatever reason, during takeoff, the way the plane is built, it was likely to end up in this situation where basically it was going to crash. And Moon of Alabama has done a great job of covering this and explaining why the planes crashed and why Boeing made a mistake. But, apparently they knew about this problem and just kind of let it persist without making a big deal out of it because I guess like maybe it didn't require necessarily a redesign of the plane, even though it seems like a fairly dangerous problem, but pilots should have been like trained to react very quickly to this, because the solution is difficult and counterintuitive. And so for that reason, Boeing really made a mistake here, and the company was really suffering leading into this because, hey, I don't like to fly. You know what I mean? It's not a thing I like to do. And when I was buying plane tickets, and this is something I never done in the past, I was looking to see what plane I would be flying in. And I was definitely not going to fly in one of those. So I don't know. Well, I'll let you go back on it.
Right, yeah, and we should say too, like those Max, the 737 Max crashed. There was 2 catastrophic crashes that killed hundreds and hundreds of people, and so Boeing was definitely struggling even prior to the pandemic. But now, yeah, this has done even greater damage to their like private or commercial activities. However, Boeing's business as a arms contractor who deals with the government has not changed at all. That has barely budged. They've continued to get like these sweetheart contracts from the government. It doesn't really matter how they. I don't know. It doesn't matter what else is happening. That's going to stay consistent, with Boeing. And it seems that their CEO is very confident that that's not going to change. That's going to continue to happen regardless of who wins in November, whether it's Trump or Biden. I mean, we know that Trump is a big fan of arms deals. He often talks about how they create jobs. And this is something, too, that I think Calhoun actually touched on during this call with reporters. He said that he doesn't think Congress is too likely to change this either. They're not going to make any effort to change the arrangement with the arms industry, because he said they usually come together when it comes to creating jobs. And so this is like the big, this is the big talking point of the weapons dealers, is that they're always saying how much, these ridiculous sweetheart contracts are so good for the American public because they create jobs. And Trump is definitely on board with that. I'm not totally sure what Biden's like openly stated position on this is, but I would expect that he would kind of take an Obama-like stance on it, which, means continuing all these arms sales, not really upsetting that status quo,
Right. I think I remember Obama signing massive multi-billion-dollar deals with Saudi Arabia for arms sales. Now, I don't think all those sales actually end up happening. And so when they say, sign $100 billion worth of arms sales, those are potential sales. Some of them happen. Some of those sales don't. But, when you look at just how many did go through and how much money Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon was making during the Obama years. Yeah, they're fine with, I guess, whoever it is. You think they have at least a preference or an argument when it came to like, oh, Trump wants to build the F-15S variants that, are competitive with the F-35, whereas, Joe Biden prefers the F-35 because they know that they're just going to buy both at the end of the day. It doesn't matter. And so I think you brought up there and start to get into the fact that all these weapon sales at least require Congress's passive consent, or at least, not a majority active, rejection of this. And so it just goes to show like how many hundreds of people go along with this process and just allow it to happen in our government. And yet all these people are supposed to be diametrically opposed. They're, for most, I don't know about most Americans, but there are a lot of Americans who, really believe that one party is good and one party is evil. And yet they come together on all these issues of war and peace that really involve the most amount of spending the U.S. government does and the most amount of harm the U.S. government does. So I as I become more libertarian over the years, this is the one thing I really haven't been able to, wrap my head around is how do people just when they, see that the parties all come together to vote for the wars and these massive $740 billion spending bills for the Pentagon almost passed with unanimous consent. I thought they were supposed to be different. I thought they were supposed to hate each other. And yet, they only argue on the margins of, what the U.S. tax, rate should be. Even this year, there was only a small number of congressmen in the middle of a pandemic who would vote for a 10% temporary decrease in the Pentagon budget. They're talking about cutting it by so they're cutting it by $74 billion, right? So that would have brought the total, and I'm trying to do some quick math here. What would that be? Well, like $650 billion, a little bit more than that, right? So, we're still talking about over $500 billion, $500 billion spent on the Pentagon this year, even with that, what they thought was a massive catastrophic budget cut. And everybody just goes along and consents to it. The fact that there's not any real debate is really harmful because, me and you have really took time to highlight, I think, on this show where Trump's foreign policy has been different from Obama's in a lot of the places where it has been different and has been worse. Although there are a couple exceptions to that, but for the most part, it's been the same. How many of the countries that Trump bombed, Obama also bombed, right? He's continued the wars that everybody freaked out about. Trump was going to become an isolationist and bring troops home from around the world. Well, that really hasn't happened. Maybe we're going to get out of Afghanistan before his presidency is up, but it really doesn't look like it right now. And even then, you have a consensus coming together in Congress that's in part bipartisan. It's Liz Cheney and Nancy Pelosi trying to prevent Trump from bringing these troops home. So, I'll let you weigh in a little bit on this bipartisan consensus that we have, and what can we do to wake some people up to the fact that they come together on a lot. And I forget who says that, they think you got the stupid party and the evil party, and every once in a while they come together to do something that's particularly stupid and evil. It's almost always foreign policy or, bailouts for big companies.
Right. And that's what you call bipartisanship, something that's really stupid and really evil. I mean, I guess I understand why there is sort of that unity around some of these questions if we start looking at like the money that a lot of these arms dealers start throwing around. I mean, if you look at a lot of like the top think tanks around Washington, a lot of the people who are influencing thinking on policy and stuff, they are bankrolled by arms dealers. And so oftentimes, and not only them, but like the Saudis, all kinds of other political and pressure groups go into that and go into forming sort of this mainstream bipartisan consensus. However, you would think that some of the people observing this, like people who are not involved in power, like it's odd that they sort of aren't more, baffled by this. Like you're saying, like, why are they the same on this? Isn't one party supposed to be good and one bad, regardless of which one you think is good or bad? Shouldn't they be different? And why are they so the same on this one question? And I think it's again easy to answer why the actual lawmakers and the actual people in power are like that, because I think they can be influenced. But it is very odd why more people are not baffled by this similarity. And I don't know, I'm not really sure what to do. I mean, I think what we do is like, this is my best answer, is to try to just, explain this stuff and observe that it is happening. But, I don't know if that's enough, honestly. Strategy is kind of a difficult question.
Presidents that we've recently had, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and now Trump. And when you would talk to, people about these presidents, there is like a never Trump coalition that's fairly large, where there's a consensus that, the group of three have been far better than our current president. And, I've recently today been trying to point out to somebody that, hey, look, like, there are body counts here. And Trump killed a lot of people during his bombing campaigns in Mosul and Raqqa, and he killed a lot of civilians in Afghanistan with his Iron Tempest war. And I'm sure hundreds of people have been killed by the U.S. drone strikes and airstrikes in Somalia. And he's responsible for, a portion of the deaths. I guess we can maybe split them between him and Obama on Yemen. But, I mean, when you talk about George Bush and the Iraq war, you have a million people dead, and that doesn't count all the other kind of foreign policy stuff he was doing with Bill Clinton. Just looking at example number one, the sanctions, which maybe did end up killing 500,000 children. Madeleine Albright says she was fine with that and did, kill 300,000 children or so. So that's not all that much better. The starvation war in Somalia and all these things that happened under these presidents. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dead people. And yet there's like nothing that says that this is something that should be weighed about, weighed in on when you talk about how good a president was. Like, their foreign policy was, they were trying to do the right thing. I think on the Bush case, there is maybe a greater number of people who actually kind of don't like his foreign policy. And then on Obama, there's some people who said he did go far enough on things. But, I think when you go back and look, the foreign policy is kind of the one thing that everybody shrugs their shoulders on, kind of like, well, they did the best they could on it. And I don't know if you have anything else to say on that. Well, I'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah, it's almost like there's like an expectation that they're going to. I mean, a lot of people won't equate like aggressive foreign policies with the way we would equate that with the body count, with the oceans of blood that are spilled in pursuing these ridiculous policies and trying to give democracy to Afghanistan or Syria or whatever it is, or whatever we're doing in Somalia right now, whatever the goal is with that at the moment, counterterrorism or whatever. People don't tie that so much, I guess, to the bloodshed and they let the euphemisms work for them in that case. So yeah, they were just trying to give democracy to somewhere, and they don't actually think in the real terms of who's actually dying and trying to carry that policy out. And we've been in a moment, I guess, it's gone on for so long that we've had these several wars raging on in multiple different countries at the same time that it's almost like, it doesn't even factor into people's opinions about someone as a politician anymore. It's just sort of like, that's a given. We just accept that as a given. And then you weigh the other things, the stuff that doesn't matter, all the other marginal crap. But sort of, it's just like, you don't even question their support for some aggressive foreign policy. And, again, we are doing our best to change that, but it is a overwhelming sort of zeitgeist right now that people seem to think that way.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to the next story that we have, and this one's about AOC. And Will, I think he has something good to say about her, so let's not shock everybody too much and give him a second to take a breath and tell us what she's been up to.
Yeah, everyone take a seat, please, for this. But yeah, so a few weeks ago, I think on our last show or the second to last show we did together, we talked about how the U.S. military was using video games and streaming platforms like Twitch to try to interest really young kids into joining the military, like as young as 12 or 13 years old. And it's basically like a de facto recruiting program. And in some cases, they would do things that would literally send these kids to recruiting forms. Like they had these fake giveaways they do through Twitch, which if people aren't aware, Twitch is like a video streaming platform, often where people will stream video game play and live stream that kind of stuff. And the military was trying to interest kids in this kind of stuff. And they were doing giveaways through Twitch that would ultimately point them toward a recruiting form. And so that's clearly the goal of all this is outreach to very young gamers, usually through war games like Call of Duty and stuff. So last week, though, there was an attempt to put an amendment in a congressional spending bill to block all of this funding for the military to do this kind of thing, and actually to stop the military from doing any kind of outreach with video games at all, or as they call it, esports, which I guess is the term they've applied to it. And that amendment to block that was introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the New York Democrat and the self-declared socialist, who typically I don't have many kind words for, as you said. There's a lot of things I would oppose her on. However, in this case, I think her effort was very much worth praising. This is a good amendment, regardless of who was actually behind it, I think. But unfortunately, the House easily voted down this measure. Like I said, they were trying to put it into this broader spending bill, and it got defeated pretty easily. I forget the exact the exact vote, but the GOP, though, voted against it unanimously. They were completely united in shooting it down. And then over 100 Democrats also joined them. It was nearly half of all the Democrats in Congress.
Well, were we just talking about the bipartisan consensus there?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So there's another clear case of that coming up. But I guess, AOC was trying to parlay this and spin this into some kind of good news, which I think it was a little bit of a tortured argument. But she was saying how, hey, at least a majority of Democrats did vote against this thing. But on something so kind of obvious and common sense, you'd think they would have been able to, find some more agreement among their progressive liberal selves. But apparently not. But I should say, though, that, unfortunately, despite the fact this amendment was blocked, in the last month or so, the U.S. Army actually did stop doing all this stuff on Twitch. If you look at their profile, they have not been streaming or anything. And largely that is because of all this negative attention that was generated by recent press coverage. There were a couple write-ups that were fairly critical of this practice in the last few weeks. And then also, I guess the military was also taking heat from Twitch itself because of these deceptive giveaways they were doing, where it didn't seem like there was actually anything they were giving away, and this stuff was all leading kids to these recruiting forums and stuff. And so it seems at least one branch of the military has stopped doing this on Twitch. But not all of them, though. If you actually go and look at the Navy's account on Twitch, they are still streaming. They have a verified account, and you just earlier today, I just wanted to check. And yeah, sure enough, they have stuff up in the last 24 hours. So this is continuing. And so just because the Army stopped doesn't mean that the whole military has. And so it is really unfortunate that this bill was voted down. Or this amendment was voted down, excuse me. And one issue I think here in Congress, and this is something that AOC and many others were also pointing out right after the vote on this amendment, But one issue is that lawmakers, on average, are pretty old in Congress. I think they're around like 60 years old, like 58. It's like 58.2 or something, as the average age of a congressman. And a lot of these people have no idea what Twitch even is. Like they're completely oblivious to what they're even voting on. I mean, you would think that it wouldn't be that hard to understand the concept of like using a video game about war to try to interest children in war and to recruit them into the military. I don't think you really deeply have to understand like Twitch or the internet or video games to see why that might be an issue. But for politicians,
you know what?
I guess so.
I'll give them a break on that, because the idea of people watching people play video games seems so stupid. Like, you know what I mean? Like, rather than play the video game yourself, you're watching somebody play it. And a lot of these, people are like just playing Call of Duty multiplayer. They're not even, doing like a tutorial video or something like that. So it took me a while to understand Twitch, but I will say, like, I work in a school for my day job, and it definitely, especially among I think the like kids that are just now coming into high school, at least from my experience, it was that age range are really into this stuff. And so, and again, they're probably not supposed to be watching, that content. It's I remember why I bought Call of Duty. I had to bring my dad with me. He shows the guy his ID because I'm too young to have it. So, maybe they're not supposed to be on that channel, but I'm pretty sure, you had to be one of these very old congressmen to not think that a kid's not going to lie about their age to get on the website. Those are just the rules of the internet.
Right. And I even just more basically, maybe this is more of a criticism for like their colleagues who should be people like AOC who should be trying to explain this to her Democratic colleagues. But I wouldn't think it'd be that hard to explain to them that, like, yes, the military is trying to use war video games to generate interest among 12-year-olds in the military. Like, I don't think that would be that hard to understand that concept. I don't think you have to like get what Twitch is as a streaming platform or understand how video games work or anything. Like, I would think the basic sort of morality behind this issue would be fairly easy to see, but for these congressmen, I guess not. I guess like because most of them voted against this, so I guess they can't wrap their head around this. So that they did kill this amendment.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I guess just from my perspective, seeing how like people follow their favorite streamer on YouTube or Twitch, and they know a lot about the guy, what games they play, what their stats are, what their like strengths are in the different games. That I guess from my perspective, I could see how these kids could get very attached to these people. You even see it on Twitter with adults where there's, somebody on Twitter that they really like. And even though they've never met the person, like they get kind of attached to them and like attack people who attack them and do weird stuff like that. And so, this is a real thing that's happening where these kids, I'm sure, are getting attached to the recruiters. And not to mention, if you could join the army to be on the esports team and play Call of Duty. So basically you join the army to play video games about being, in the like fantasy of the army where you just run around and only have bad guys to kill and stuff like that. I mean, that just sounds like I know when I was 13, that would have been like the just dream job, right? Like playing video games for the army. How cool is that?
Yeah, definitely. And like, look, I don't want to be too like harsh on the video games themselves. I'm not saying that like, oh, if you play Call of Duty, you're going to go join the military and you're going to want to go kill people or something. Like, I don't know. I think it's perfectly fine to have that as a pastime to play these video games. But quite different from that, I think, is knowingly and deliberately using like we all understand that like little kids, little boys are very into these kind of video games. I think a lot of us have children and younger relatives, and we can kind of see that. And so like knowingly and deliberately tailoring your recruiting strategy around these video games and trying to like circumvent the typical recruiting process. I do think there's something very disgusting about that. But apparently not most lawmakers in Congress. Apparently they don't. The ones who at least understand the situation, they apparently see no problem with that.
Right, which is really disappointing, and I think it is a practice that needs to end. It seems like one thing that may have been effective and something that I think has already come up is just the idea around like, can government agencies block people on social media sites? And right. If not, let's all get Twitch accounts, and then we could go in and while the army is spreading their propaganda about the great things they do and how the drone strikes take out the bad guys, we could talk about how the drone strikes kill the children and you don't want that on your soul. You want to make sure that you stay away from these people, and that these people will lead you into an organization where you're going to force to do bad things. So that's something that can be done. And if they block us, then I think they get into First Amendment problematic territory, because these people are taking our tax dollars. You're gonna take my tax dollars and then block me on Twitch? That's not right. So yeah.
There were reports about that. There was some talk about that. I think the journalist at, I think, was it The Nation, who covered this? Jordan
it was
Uhl?
at The Nation. Yep.
And I think Jordan Uhl, I think is his name. He was writing about when he was covering this. He posted a tweet. He said he's doing a speed run to see how quickly he could get banned on Twitch by the U.S. Army. And he said what dear whoever the streamer was for the Army said what's your favorite U.S. war crime? And he got banned within 30 seconds. And some people are saying that even though this is just a video game streaming platform, no, a government agency can't ban you like that for just speaking your mind, or as a government agency, they're I don't know, there are different rules that apply to them. It's not like they're just some guy on there, some streamer. And so that is apparently an issue.
And, keeping with our theme of the bipartisan consensus here, Will, we have now the war on terror come home. This is something that, libertarians have been talking about and warning about. And yet, when Bush was picking out people from all over the world, throwing them in Guantanamo Bay, denying them all of their different rights, habeas corpus and stuff like that. Then look at Obama signing the 2012 NDAA, and, judge, jury, and executioner with drone strikes. All these things, happened with very little resistance from the Congress, and pretty much passed through with absolute, bipartisan consensus. I guess there were a handful of Democrats that stood up to the Iraq war, but in it, then they just continued to fund the thing no matter how poorly it went, and never stood up to it. And so looking at the next issue here, where Portland, where we have this war come home, and essentially both parties have allowed it to happen all these years with the 1033 program. This is the Pentagon program where they're transferring, a war equipment to the U.S. Started under Clinton, increased under Bush. Obama, quote unquote, limited after so long, but transferred, millions and millions of dollars of this military equipment into the hands of local police forces. And then, as you could imagine, Donald Trump did what Donald Trump does on this, and undid what Obama did, and then is giving them even more money, I believe, than they ever had before. And so, we have this situation where things were getting really tense in Portland. Watching the tactics of each side, they seem to be increasing with, the secret police style kidnappings happening on the streets, and then the protesters throwing near bombs at the police. I know that they wore fireworks, but at the same time, the way they threw them and how large they exploded, certainly not impossible for somebody to get hurt. Not to sound like a Karen or anything, but somebody could really lose an eye in a situation like that, or get some serious burns. And if I'm not saying that justifies the police tactics, but I do know that the police are going to respond to that by escalating. And so I do think that was the point of the, rioters, protesters, agitators throwing those fireworks bombs in there. So, it's a hot summer, Will. Things are getting hot, and I don't know, this people starting to talk about pulling out the federal forces, see if we get a little decrease in tensions there. Give us an update of what's going on.
Yeah, sure. So there have been actually a few different developments in Portland over the last week. One of them is a little more optimistic, and the other one was fairly disturbing, I think, and not so optimistic. First, though, I will just say in terms of the fireworks and stuff, there was last week a kid, an 18-year-old kid who was charged with arson, which that's up to 20 years in prison, after throwing one of these explosives at the courthouse there in Portland. And yeah, if you go and watch that video, that is not that's no joke, dude. If someone got hit by that explosive, that could really hurt someone. I think even in body armor, that was a gigantic blast. And you could see people were surprised, whoa, what the hell was that, when you see this thing go off. And so in some of these cases, I don't think it's wrong to say they are throwing, bombs basically at the feds here. But yeah, last week, in what looks to be a fairly promising development in Portland, the feds have started to I don't think they've actually left the city, but they have been off the streets for the last couple nights, as far as I can see here. And this is after the Department of Homeland Security inked a deal with Oregon's governor, Kate Brown, where they agreed to have the state police kind of come in and more fully take over for the feds. And it is interesting. You were talking about bipartisanship. Like all the things that led up to this, that allowed this to even happen, allowed this to be possible, certainly were enabled by bipartisanship. But on this issue itself, since these feds have been in Portland, it's been insanely partisan, like how much the Democrats are pretending to oppose this. But it is just interesting to see like how much they actually enable this in the first place. It's the same kind of thing with like surveillance and so many other government powers. They decry Trump as a tyrant and a fascist, and then they easily, vote to give him all these new powers. And so like we are kind of seeing a similar or to at least maintain those same powers. They will never shrink the power of the state. They always have to maintain it, even as they decry it as it's used in a way that they don't like. And so the governor of Portland, or the governor of Oregon, excuse me, Kate Brown, she's sort of in that camp as like a shrieking Democrat who's opposed to this. But they did come to some deal with the Department of Homeland Security to get rid of these feds. And as I mentioned on a previous show, we've covered this a few times, the DHS oversaw all the federal agencies that were in Portland. They oversaw this task force. So they were taking point on those negotiations. Now, what is a bit weird about this is that right after the DHS had confirmed this withdrawal deal to news outlets, both Trump and the head of the DHS, Chad Wolf, were signaling pretty strongly that they would not be leaving. That they were Trump was saying that he would send in the National Guard to replace the feds, to replace the police agencies. He was saying that as late as Thursday afternoon. And Wolf on the same day had been saying that if it looked like the local and state cops couldn't keep things under control, that the feds would stay. But then just a few hours later, it became apparent that actually they were pulling back, because on Thursday night, Thursday was the first night that the state police actually came in and defended the courthouse. And actually what seems, as far as I saw these last couple nights from Thursday through the weekend, things have actually been a lot more calm. Like on that first night on Thursday, I don't think there was any tear gas used at all, when previous to that, the feds had been unleashing tons and tons of tear gas every single night. And so it does seem like things are at least calming down for a little bit here. But as far as I understand, though, the feds are still in Portland. Like they haven't actually left the city. They're on standby just in case anything, might happen. And so I think this is a fairly good development, seeing that the feds are sort of pulling back, but I'm not willing to celebrate this as a victory yet at all, or as a great thing. I think they could very easily come back out. I saw that Fox News was reporting this, that there were still some violent confrontations over the weekend. I saw other outlets sort of downplaying that. Reuters had one that was saying on Thursday how there was no tear gas used. But again, I think this is a fairly, in terms of good developments, I think this sort of qualifies as one in terms of the feds sort of things are starting to tamp down a little bit in Portland.
Yeah, I think I saw on Friday, Michael Tracy was doing a live stream, who, has been, I think, just a very important voice in going around and showing what the results of all these riots have been. And, people have been very critical of him, basically saying he's, against Black Lives Matter. And I don't think that's the case. I think he's just trying to go around and do some reporting. But he was in Portland and he was walking up to the courthouse, but this was during the daytime, so there was no protesting going on. People were just walking around. And I guess one of the guys that was staying there came up and was very friendly. It was a guy from the Department of Homeland Security, talked to him and basically said that, yeah, they're scaling down the presence, but they're still there. And as long as the local police handle it, they're not going to get involved. And so that seems to be what's going on. And it does seem to be an example of, Trump or somebody within the Department of Homeland Security being able to, do something other than what government usually does, and that's escalate. And it looks like they're de-escalating the situation. Just talking about the bipartisanship again, that, there has been a real Democratic push to, end this thing. One of the things that I took AOC to task for on the show last week was that she had introduced a bill to defund this, Department of Homeland Security operation that Trump is running right now, but very explicitly said that, hey, I am not taking away the power of the federal government to do that. The federal government doesn't have to come to Congress to get this funding in the future. Just in this, one particular case, I oppose it, which is in a way almost worse, because it's just giving the executive a blank check to do it in the future, unless there's congressional intervention to stop it. What Congress needs to do is pass a law that says this absolutely cannot be done unless we say so.
Yeah, right. That does seem like kind of a case of special pleading. It's kind of like I'm saying too. Is like they always want to retain these overall general powers, leave the door open for that, but then they want to, shriek and cry when it's used in a way they don't like. So yeah, I find that often fairly hypocritical. But there was another thing in Portland this week that was much less, even though I'm not celebrating the temporary, at least temporary withdrawal as like a total victory or anything. That was at least fairly good. This other story though is not good at all. It's very, disconcerting. So the Washington Post actually got a hold of intelligence reports that were compiled by the DHS on journalists covering the protests and the unrest there, and specifically journalists who were writing critical things about the DHS and like reporting on leaked DHS materials and documents and stuff about the protests and things like that. And apparently these intelligence reports were fairly detailed. They're like going as far as like noting down how many times a reporter's tweet was liked and shared on a particular thing. Like it looked like they were following people fairly closely and like compiling information on them, like dossiers almost. And usually they would do these kind of intelligence reports on like wanted people or like terrorism suspects or violent criminals. And they would disseminate that information to other police agencies to help them in like an investigation or making an arrest. But it's a whole different thing when you're talking about doing this for journalists who are obviously supposed to be completely protected by the First Amendment in covering protests, and as well as when they report on leaked material on classified. And these intelligence reports actually aren't classified either, but even just leaked internal government documents, like they're supposed to have a right to do that. And it's odd that the DHS would be, devoting these resources to target and surveil them and compile dossiers on them like some kind of authoritarian state. Like they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to confine that activity to criminals and not reporters. And so I kind of expect they do this a lot. Like in this case, like it's kind of, it's come to light because it's connected to something of national importance, these Portland protests. But like I expect they probably fly under the radar a lot with this kind of thing, where they, maybe on a more local stories. And the DHS has tried to argue and kind of push back a little bit that like, hey, some of these protesters are pretending to be press, and they're sort of using that as, using it as disguise to attack officers and pretending to be journalists. But it doesn't really apply here when you're talking about these intelligence reports. We're talking about like a New York Times reporter was in one of these, and the editor at Lawfare, well-known and established people in the media who clearly are not some like black bloc punks trying to exploit protections for journalists so that they can, attack a cop. And the DHS has actually specifically acknowledged that this happens too. They said like there's now no question about whether they actually did this, and they say they've now ordered this to stop. But yet at the same time, they're also trying to say that they never actually tracked or monitored any legitimate protesters or journalists, despite the fact that we have like proof that they did actually compile reports on legit journalists. This is established. Like this is not really a matter of, I don't know, they can't really deny this, but I guess they still are. Like they're being pretty shady, but like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth on this issue, I guess.
No, I think this is particularly concerning because we've seen how bad the police treatment towards journalists has been throughout the George Floyd protest and riots and stuff like that going on. But even, especially during the very beginning, during the protests, the police were very confrontational and at times, unprovoked aggressive against people clearly marked as journalists, for no apparent reason. And so you have to wonder if, they've been compiling these reports and sending them to the police saying that, or especially if in other cases these were used, like in the case with terrorists or something like that, I think the message that you're sending to all these police departments is that the journalists are dangerous. And so I guess it doesn't surprise me a whole lot that the police acted in this way if they were getting these reports towards journalists, because it's essentially just building up their fear against them.
Right, exactly. And that is typically the purpose of these intelligence reports, is for these federal agencies to like gather this info and to disseminate it to more local departments and stuff and to help them in their investigations and all this. But yeah, if they're doing it on journalists, then yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense when we see these outcomes with police targeting reporters. And, maybe they know, oh, that particular guy over there, that's that particular New York Times reporter who, published this leaked thing. And so, that is sort of, disconcerting. Now, I guess they could take it and no one's actually argued this, but I guess they could try to spin it in the other way and say, hey, we're just, telling the police who is a journalist so they don't target them or something. But that's clearly not been what's happening, because they have been targeting journalists. We've seen all kinds of, unnecessary force used against people who clearly are marked as journalists. And like, I don't deny, or I imagine it's probably the case. Some people are putting on a press vest and saying like, oh yeah, I'm a reporter. And then they're hurling a firework or something 10 minutes later. They're trying to, do both. But, there's many cases where you can clearly see some guy's got like a big, a setup, like a camera rig or something, like, or you see him all day. He's clearly filming the events. He's not protesting. So I don't know. I think it's not always that hard to tell who's a reporter and who might be, pretending to be one.
Right. And I think especially where we are today, where essentially everybody has a news camera in their hand. I mean, the video people could film with iPhones is phenomenal, and TV HD quality a lot of times, right? And so you do have a case where everybody is kind of a potential journalist, and so it's just, I guess, unfortunate that the police have to be so black and white, and they're thinking that it's only the people who mark themselves as journalists, and then that ends up being exploited, rather than just treating everybody like they have the natural rights that they have, and their only job is to interfere when somebody's property rights are being damaged or violated. But that certainly isn't the mindset of anybody and what anybody's advocating. Before we wrap up, Will, I had this one interesting story I had talked about last week on the show, and I wanted to update. And it's an event that's going on in Brazil, and I know that there's a lot of buzz there because the president, I guess it's still fair to call him a president, I don't know, Bolsonaro has come down with the COVID, and it's pretty bad there. He's been tweeting it out, being like, hey, it's not a big deal at all, I'm perfectly okay, don't worry about it. So I'm not quite sure, I haven't been following that too closely, but this particular thing going on in the Supreme Court seems interesting. I guess my interpretation of the events is that the Supreme Court is not in the kind of pocket of Bolsonaro, and had ruled that Facebook needed to ban the accounts of several officials that were tied to Bolsonaro for some slanderous things they said. Facebook, I had talked about on the show, had went along with this. And they had said ban their accounts, but I guess they only banned the accounts in Brazil. And so now the Supreme Court has fined Facebook, saying they didn't comply because they didn't ban them globally. And so this is a point where I'm kind of torn on Facebook, where in one sense, good, they shouldn't ban these people, globally. And I guess unless maybe they're advocating some kind of violence very clearly, they're saying like, hey, you should start picking on this ethnic group. You should beat up these people here. This guy is dangerous. You should kill him. There's absolutely no reason to ban these accounts, and that if especially if they're any kind of government officials, there should be a benefit in people knowing what these that should be the Facebook policy. And so hopefully they seriously stand up here and say we're not going to go along with it. We're going to maintain that what Facebook's stance is acceptable speech. I guess I don't know what Facebook's policy is, but they should have one where they allow people to say things that aren't overtly violent on the network, and not take these officials off. But yet the Supreme Court's pushing, although Facebook has already, I think, conceded too much. I think this has a lot of implications for other areas of the world. You look at like Israel, Palestine, where the Israeli government wants a lot of censorship in India with the Kashmir region. They've outright shut down the internet and have a lot of censorship. China, the whole mainland, but specifically if you look at like Hong Kong or Tibet, they have a lot of censorship and control over. And so how these tech companies decide to respond is important. And I think we need to try to push our tech companies to have a more open platform, not only for Americans, but for people around the world. And that also means not complying with American sanctions, and say like kicking the Ayatollah off of Twitter or something like that. Not that I like the Ayatollah and think that people should necessarily be listening to him to follow his word, but they probably should listen to what the guy has to say. And if he outs himself as a criminal, then that's ammunition to use against him, rather than silencing him and not especially allowing like the American audience to just hear what the Ayatollah has to say, like audiences around the world are treated to Donald Trump's tweets. So Will, I'll let you say anything you want, and then you can wrap up.
Yeah, sure. So I haven't had a chance to really look into this Brazil story yet, but it does sound like it kind of plays into this ongoing issue where, like, I think it is important that these social media platforms do stay like entirely independent from states and governments all around the world, because when they're just a private company, I'm not really too concerned about, like, I don't really care if they're following my data to, like, advertise to me or something. I don't find that, like, I voluntarily, in fact, do that. Like, I voluntarily use these platforms knowing that they do this. However, once you're talking about something with police power, you're talking about the state who can send men with weapons to your home to put you in a cage and stuff. Once that's sort of joined to joined to these social media networks, that becomes like a terrifying surveillance network. And so I just want anything that might, erode the independence of social media networks from government agencies. Like, I want to, I don't want that to happen. We had these tech hearings in the United States last week where you had these, billionaire CEOs, these major tech platforms of, you had Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, but mostly Zuckerberg here because we're talking about social media. And I think a lot of people take the position they want government to make Zuckerberg do this or that. They want government to legislate somehow to make Facebook act in a way that fits their politics, whether it's to keep, protect conservatives or anything. But I think that's all wrong-headed. I really don't think we should be pushing governments in any case to be, imposing their authorities over social media networks and making them do things that the government wants them to do. I just generally I would rather take the risks of what a social media platform will do with their own stupid policies, even if they are, driven by wokeness or whatever, overwrought progressive ideals or something. I would rather take that risk than have them become joined with the government. Like, so anything that goes in that direction, I don't want to see. It does sound like in Brazil, that's sort of what direction it's heading in. So that's sort of my comment on that. If people would like to find what I write, they can find that at my Twitter handle the most easily. I think that's at the Will Porter, just my name, the Will Porter. And if you want to see my archives, I have archives at the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, Antiwar.com, and the Daily Sheeple.
All right, Will. Well, thanks for coming on. Everybody, if you notice, Will has a new Twitter handle there. He was WKP and Cat before, so you notice that's a change, but I hope most people just look at the names. I've also changed my Twitter handle recently. I'm Kyle Anzalone _, and then check out the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor there. I write the daily news roundup, and both the roundup and the show are on the homepage. Will, thanks for joining, and I'll talk to you next Monday.
Thanks, Kyle.